Thank you so much for joining us today for what is going to be an important conversation about food security during a pandemic and how businesses can step into support. My name is Szczepanek, and I am the global practice leader for our food practice for Porter Novelli, which is a global purpose communications consultancy, and I'm going to be moderating today's conversation. Meaningful Business has assembled an incredibly experienced, innovative, and purposeful group of panelists who can speak to this issue. So I'm going to introduce those now. We have Facundo Etchebehere, who is the Vice President of Global Public Affairs and Corporate Affairs for Essential Dairy and Plant-Based at Danone. His role is to lead issues management and the articulation of Danone's stakeholder engagement strategy. We also have Siobhan Kelly. She is with the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, where she specializes in agribusiness. The FAO leads international efforts to defeat hunger and improve nutrition and food security. Snigdha Sahal is the Executive Director for India Action Against Hunger, the world's hunger specialist that was founded with a simple goal in mind: no more hungry children in India. Tessa Clarke is the CEO of Olio, a mobile app which connects neighbors with each other and local businesses so that surplus food can be shared and not thrown away. Amoo Addo is the founder and executive director of Food for All Africa. Elijah started his career as a chef before becoming a social entrepreneur, where he created a food sharing mobile app that redistributes leftover food from local restaurants, supermarkets, food distribution companies, and farmers to disadvantaged children in orphanages, hospitals, and schools. Just to set some context, the COVID-19 pandemic may affect us all, but it doesn't affect us all equally. Geographical and economic factors contribute to the access and affordability of the basics, which are magnified during an emergency. According to FAO statistics, 820 million people around the world are currently experiencing chronic hunger and lack the caloric energy to lead normal lives. 113 million are so hungry that their lives are in danger, and they rely on external assistance for their survival. The New York Times yesterday published a report that 1 in 5 children in the US don't have enough to eat. However, individuals and businesses can play a role in delivering food security for all. So I'm going to start out with a question, and I'm going to just ask each panelist to go one by one and answer it. But can you just give a 1-minute summary on the food security context as you see it in the area in which you work and how the pandemic has affected that? Siobhan, I'm going to ask you to start.
Okay, Jimmy, thank you so much. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you fine, thank you.
Okay, perfect. Well, thank you very much. Thank you to Meaningful Business for the invitation to participate in this very meaningful and important dialogue. So in terms to put it in context, I think we might look back to the 2008 food price crisis, and this crisis was triggered, as we know, by an actual shortage of specific staples on the market. So in particular, wheat was a crop that at that time there were a number of droughts around the world in the biggest producing countries, namely Russia, for instance, and Russia put up an export ban, price hikes where the consequences also had a ripple-on effect with other staples across the world. And wheat, rice, soybean, maize, for instance. And so that was a very different situation, I think, to the one that we find ourselves in today. But at the beginning of the crisis, of the COVID-19 crisis, there was most definitely the fear that there would be an escalation of a similar scale, in that countries would put up export bans and then this would have a triggering effect throughout the world. There were a couple of cases. Russia put up export bans for a couple of months, Vietnam also, and there was that fear that it would have a chain effect, and there were it did have obviously implications on prices, but not to the extent that was originally feared. And so the issue now that we're facing is that because of the different types of the lockdowns, particularly in the food service sector and in the institutional procurement, canteens and schools, you're seeing, I suppose, extremes. On one hand, there's cases where there's food rotting in fields, and this is having, obviously an effect on commodity prices. For instance, I was just reading in the Financial Times yesterday that cattle farmers in Ireland, for where I'm from, they've lost €100 per head because of the closure of the food services and the restaurant industry. Whereas if another article then I read on another page was in Nigeria, couscous producers there, because it's a packaged commodity that has a long shelf life, they have had to carry out or compress 2 months production into 2 weeks, and they're struggling to keep up with the demand. So you're seeing these extremes, but one of the repercussions of this is the food losses and waste that we're seeing across the world. And I know that we're going to go into that situation, into that part of the discussion later on. So I won't cover it now, but I think that just gives you an indication of some of the issues that we're dealing with today, and comparing them as well to other food crises that we've had in the past.
Thanks, Siobhan. Snigdha, do you want to take this question?
I know. Thank you so much, and thank you to Meaningful Business for organizing this. And I'm so glad to actually have made acquaintance of such smart people across the globe. From the Indian context, we all know that India is a very, very diverse geographies, diverse country. Right now, the position is that there is around 400 million workers that are out of work. There's also a huge issue of reverse migration, which means that people who have left their villages in search of work to the cities have now all gone back or are going back. And this has led to severe loss of income, which in turn is going to and is leading to loss of food and nutrition security. But also in India, it also comes as a bundle. It doesn't come just as a hunger problem. Hunger could be an effect, but there are like multiple layered problems around this. The families that were already on the verge of malnutrition are going to get pushed into it. So we expect to see a very, very high rise of severely malnourished children in the near future. We also know that the healthcare systems that were already severely burdened are going to get a very, very high burden now. Gender-based violence we're expecting is going to be skyrocketing, and so will a lot of education loss, because not every small public school will be able to make it online, so there would be academic dropouts. So all in all, it does look like that one thing is going to lead to another, and which is, I think, also why we all need to work together. Also, in our case, it's very different when it comes to rural and urban poor. Urban poor are living in slums, and they face a completely different problem, which is of space. There is also a problem of a loss of income again over there. Whereas in rural areas, space is not a constraint, but actually putting in the lockdown measures are, it's such a remote area that lockdown measures may not be put that stringently, but so each location has a different problem for us that we need to solve. When it comes to food security, also we have the population gets divided between ration card holders and non-ration card holders. A ration card is a basic identity card that Indians have, for which they can go and get subsidized grains and subsidized ration. So there are so many reports that say that the non-ration card holders are not getting the support from the government. I think what we are doing is we're working very, very closely with the government. We're trying to fix these issues with them. The government is very aware that these issues are happening. In many pockets, these things are getting fixed. In many pockets, it is going to take its own time. And again, it also gets amplified because the lockdown severity keeps fluctuating from red to orange to green. And then, you know, some places that were green yesterday go in the red zone again, and the lockdown severity gets intensified. So every day is a challenge. And every day there is something new that is, that we're dealing with. But I think what we do is we work very, very closely with the government. We want to be a part of the system. We want to amplify the work that the government is doing. We are actually running mass awareness campaigns, which how much ever the government tries, they are unable to reach the last mile population. We're also not forgetting the families that we work with. So we've actually moved to a completely mobile-based counseling system, which used to be a face-to-face home visit system earlier. So there are multiple ways we're trying to provide as much grain and as much rations as we can to the most vulnerable families. And yeah, I think the struggle goes on, but also there is hope. I think collaboration is the key.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Tessa, from your perspective, would you provide us with an update?
Yeah, certainly. I think here in the UK, it's fair to say that we have seen a great awakening around our food system. First of all, we've seen a dramatic increase in people just valuing food. And it feels kind of awful to say this when there are so many other parts of the world where clearly food is very highly valued, but sadly in the Western world, it has not been valued enough. And so research has come out showing that over half of people are valuing food a lot more. And as a result, they are wasting food a lot more. So we've seen a dramatic reduction in food waste. So we've had a great awakening around the value of food. We have also had a great awakening around the horrific inequalities that we have in the UK. So we have 8.4 million people living in food poverty. That is something that existed before the COVID-19 pandemic, but the pandemic has really now brought this to light. And I think whole swathes of society and the population are now talking for the first time properly about these inequalities and are trying to figure out how we can address them. And I think certainly at the beginning of the pandemic, there was lots of talk about it being a great leveler and how we're all in the same boat. And research has now come out, just released the other day, showing that 1.5 million people in the UK are being forced to go hungry every day, and that a fifth of households with children are also going hungry. And so we've realized actually we're not in the same boat, we're in the same storm, and some people are in a very different boat than others. We've also discovered in the UK that there isn't a shortage of food, whilst it seemed like there was a shortage of food because for a long time the supermarket shelves were bare. It was more a problem of the food being in the wrong places. And so we have large quantities of food in packaging and sizes that is inappropriate for kind of a retail environment, stuck in wholesale and hospitality and leisure. So lots of businesses are desperately trying to divert that food away from those channels and into the retail channels and also into the charitable sector to ensure that we don't have sort of the twin evils of food waste and hunger coexisting alongside each other. So we've definitely got enough food, it's in the wrong places. I think also the charitable sector, which has really tried to support people living in food poverty for a long time, has struggled during this pandemic because lots of their sources of food, which were historically supermarkets that they would redistribute, no longer have spare food to give to the charitable sector. And also the charitable sector very much relied upon vulnerable populations themselves as volunteers. And so at a time when food banks are needed more than ever, the food banks are struggling to find people to volunteer to hand out and redistribute that food. As a ray of light, though, what we have discovered collectively is the power of community. And there has been just this incredible reawakening, I think, of the population as a whole, of the power of community, of the power of local. And certainly say on Olio, we're a food sharing app, we have seen people cooking for their neighbors, cooking for people who live in their community who are struggling right now. And that is something that just would not have happened 2 months ago. And I think the power of community has long been overlooked in terms of solving some of the inequities of our food system. And so I think that's very promising.
Thank you, Tessa. Facundo, would you like to answer the question?
Absolutely. Thanks for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here and learning a lot already about our exchange. So from a food company perspective, maybe I can add some elements to the conversation. No? We are present almost everywhere in the world as a global company, and this context obviously challenging for all of us. And our objective was to continue strengthening our relationship with the value chain that is proving to be key in these moments to really provide, to continue supplying in the right way consumers. So in our daily, day-to-day work, we have faced a lot of challenges as all the food companies, starting from our farmers, the most vulnerable pieces of this supply chain. In some countries, we have a different footprint. You can imagine that it's not the same, the type of production we have in US, in Europe, than in Africa, or Latin America, or China. It's totally different. So we need to de-average our answer. Our response should be adapted at local level with the same mindset. The same mindset is that we need to continue strengthening to have resilient value chain. So this was the first aim, obviously after taking care of our employees, 100,000 employees, food safety at work, the frontline workers, all the challenge of what means safety in this context that was challenging, talking with governments as well about essential industries to assess how to continue operating in a context of complexity, meaning what is essential in the value chain as well, because it's not just about having the food company operating, it's about all the raw materials, all transport, all the retailers, and all the relationships among all of these actors. So, and I can say that I am really amazed about the response, because it was very positive. There were a lot of conversations, and we face a different type of situations, and the conversation was leading all of us to solutions and finding alternative solutions. For example, the food industries, we sent a letter to the FAO, and the FAO immediately reacted, being there, supportive to all the tensions in terms of borders and cross-border for all the tracks with raw materials for food industry, and supportive in the meaningful way in the European Union. So we found different reactions, but all with the same intention to continue having a resilient value chain. But also, this is showing some opportunities, how to make more shorter the value chains, how to have local economies with more ability to supply food at local level. We have realized the value of having a local footprint as we have, and it's meaningful for consumers to be local, and this is reconnecting our brands, because we have brands, not only products. We discovered the power of our brands in different geographies, revaluing our connection with food banks. Just an example, for example, in US, our brand Too Good, that decided to give all the profit of 1 week in the Earth Week to these institutions that are working to rescue food and to fight hunger in US. So it's a combination of existing relationships that are being transformed in new meaningful relationships, partnerships that were there operating, but now within the context of this crisis, were redefined. And we are very happy to create value together, to be part of this challenge to supply food in a complex context.
Thank you. And Elijah, would you like to also answer that from your perspective in Africa?
Yes, thank you very much, and good afternoon and good morning to all panelists and attendees. Thanks very much for the opportunity. So Being a chef first and foremost and a social entrepreneur who have had diverse experience, both working within the food supply chain in Ghana and then Sub-Saharan Africa, as well I've had the opportunity to see how the food supply chain works in countries like the UK, Canada, Japan, and some other countries. 5 years ago, I foresaw, I'm not a prophet though, but I foresaw we had inefficiencies within our food supply chain, which will take just a small bit of crisis to challenge the kind of food system we have. So we, far back as 2017, we intensified a campaign towards creating partnerships and bringing together stakeholders within the food supply chain. It was quite challenging, especially from the aspect of bringing government and government agencies into the discussion. However, these few weeks, we Ghana being faced with the COVID-19 pandemic has really brought to the fore the importance of the message that we have carried along all this while. Ghana reported its first COVID-19 case somewhere March 12th. Before then, I was in Egypt from November till about February this year, and Egypt was the first country on the continent to actually record a case. But I bring in the perspective of what Egypt did. That is, they have the challenge, but it's worked to them to a certain extent. Far back as last week in December, in Cairo, I came across the government of Egypt organizing simulation exercises on ways they can actually be able to reduce the spread of COVID-19, given their population of over 100 million, if a case was to be recorded. And I think to a certain extent, it's helped them a lot. Back into Ghana, as at first week in February, all that measures that our government has put in place in ensuring that the crisis doesn't escalate in Ghana was just signing of papers whilst you are in the airline, which was quite unfortunate. So at the time we recorded our first case, already businesses within the food supply chain, most especially the local bit of the supply chain, being the smallholder farmers, being also the market women that controls the food chain in Ghana, had already started taking advantage of the situation. So prices of food from that time shot up over 50% in most local staples. And when we recorded our first case, it took our government about 2 weeks to implement a lockdown. At the time of implementing the lockdown, we had just 20 cases. And that lockdown, we had a 3 weeks lockdown. That 3 weeks lockdown was a test on our food supply chain, because food, even before the lockdown, was quite hard to come by in terms of pricing. And during the lockdown as well, movement was quite restricted. So fortunate it was for essential service providers like my organization, Food for All Africa, and then some government agencies through the Ministry of Gender and Social Protection that was actually helping within the food, getting food to people. And because there wasn't proper coordination from government side, it made demand for food so high that agitation as well there was a high level of agitation, especially in the capital, which is Accra, and then Kumasi. This agitation had to force government to let go of the lockdown after 3 weeks, at a time when we have now recorded over 2,000 cases. As I speak with you, we've recorded over 2,000 cases, and we realize if we will be in the state of lockdown, it's not going to work, especially in the area of food. Getting food to people was very difficult. The inefficiencies within the supply chain in Ghana is not designed to accept lockdown at a time like this. And for us as an organization, with the little level of partnerships we have created with some companies, and thanks to Danone recently took over one dairy company in Ghana, Farmer Ghana, and years ago we've been looking for partnership with them, knowing the essential role they play in nutrition, especially in the area of dairy products. We couldn't get, by a few weeks to lockdown, we struck that partnership, and all through the lockdown, they made sure we had loads of dairy products to give out freely to beneficiaries within affected communities. So I think such partnerships have been helpful. It's still helpful on the ground.
That's great. Thank you. And I think that this brings me to my next question, and I'd like to address this to Siobhan. And if we could just for everyone, there's a lot to get through. So if we could just keep the answers to about 90 minutes to 2 minutes, that'd be great. So just really quickly, Elijah just spoke about the partnerships with business in terms of supporting this issue. So wanted to better understand from FAO's perspective, what were recommendations to enterprises in the ag and food sector to navigate through this pandemic?
Okay, so in terms of recommendations to business, FAO works, we work with governments and institutions representing the private sector. So I would say that our recommendations are targeting the enabling environment, to enhance how enterprises work within their space. So some of those recommendations, and I can share a list of, a link to a series of policy briefs that the organization has produced over the past month or so. But more specifically, to give you an example, would be the supporting collaboration within the pre-competitive space. So, typically, farmer organizations are actually the group that are probably more organized in developing countries when it comes to food value chains. And so in order to have the voices heard of organizations also further downstream, it's very important to have associations that are strong and that can engage with governments and that can have their voices heard. So that's one area, and I think the crisis can provide that impetus, to strengthen the institutional capacity of private sector associations. Traders, for instance, in countries like Ghana, are typically, they're very fragmented as smallholders, also small food processors as well. And so it's very important to have those players under strong umbrella associations so that their voices can be heard and their concerns addressed in terms of how they can respond best to the food crisis and keep their enterprises going. Another one has been digitalization. Of course, again, the crisis has definitely provided that impetus for digitalization. You're seeing a lot of accelerated policy reforms being rushed through, and in order to be able to facilitate a lot of enterprises to stay in business. For instance, restaurants that have had to close, apps that can enable them to nonetheless connect with other service providers that can do food deliveries and so forth. An important one is as well that large food companies that are in the chain, that they make sure that they accelerate their payments back to smaller companies that are in their supply chains is a big one. The small firms, obviously, they really struggle with liquidity. They often, operate on a month-to-month basis, and so sometimes they have to wait 2 to 3, 4, up to 6 months for payments, and that's not an option in a crisis situation like this. Also, the role that these companies as well can play within their communities on communicating with their customers, for instance, good hygiene practices is also important, and demonstrating and highlighting as well to their communities that they that they're playing their role, and they're also important stakeholders within the community. And so yeah, I think they're an example of some of the recommendations and some of the areas that governments and private sector institutions can support, in particular agri-food enterprises along food supply chains in the crisis, helping them to be able to navigate their way through this very difficult period. So there's a lot more I can say, but yeah, I'll leave some space for other panelists.
Okay, does anyone else want to contribute to that answer from their perspective, either like if you're in the private sector, if there's anything that you have or any other contributions anybody wants to make to that question? If not, we can move on to the next.
So maybe I can react on the value chain, because sure, this was immediately identified as a challenge, as was said. The cash flow in the value chain in the most vulnerable part of this value chain, and only in Danone we have identified 15 small businesses, talking about from farmers, also retailers. So we have decided to put 300 million euros in a financing facility, for this cash flow need to keep the system, the ecosystem working. And this is a key. So we need to acknowledge that in this moment we need to maintain the resilience of the food system. Obviously, as Tessa was saying, we are convinced about the opportunity to transform the food system into a better one, but at least in this moment is the minimum to keep it working. And there is another aspect that I think is important to put this in the conversation. It's about the coalitions that was mentioned before, and the partnerships. Again, these are the moments where we can continue reinforcing the coalitions and within these institutions that we were mentioning before, like, I don't know, Consumer Good Forum, associating the retailers with the food industry and finding solutions, how to be there, supportive, present, reaching the population. This is key. Also, partnership like One Planet Business for Biodiversity, 20 companies working on the basics of what means a resilient agricultural system with regenerative agriculture, biodiversity protection. These moments are explaining us that the solution is now. We need this action now. And so if this crisis is triggering a change in mindset towards a better sustainable food system, is something that is going to be good for all of us. Obviously, we need to pass through the crisis. We are going to do it, but a type of partnerships, reinforcing the social network with all these institutions you are presenting that are reaching the ones who need, are reflections that we need to identify and to track now, but then to continue after the crisis.
Thank you. So another primary issue that we're facing with the pandemic has been closures and restricted movement, which affects logistics and getting food to the people who need it. It's become a huge barrier. The question is, what can businesses do to help logistics or supply chain companies access rural or desolate areas? And this is beyond metro and capital cities. One of the questions that came in through the chat was also very similar in terms of just saying, what are the partnerships and innovative tools that you're working with that is used to reach the last mile? So how do we get the food to the people who need it? Snigdha, I'm gonna ask you to start this question or answering this question and addressing that from your perspective.
So what can organizations or businesses do, especially in today's time, in Indian perspective? Go local, source from local communities, source from local businesses. That would be my top of my mind. That is what I would say, that there is enough and more available, but there is so much sourcing that happens internationally. There's so much import that happens. But if we start going local, this thing can be mitigated to a large extent. The other question was on partnerships. I think partnerships and all kinds of partnerships should be welcome. For example, one of the things we're doing is we're working with the PRIs, which is a village level local governing body. We're actually training them on hygiene practices. We're training them on mapping out their village data to see that what kind of people are the most vulnerable people. What are the situation of migrants? So going to last mile can be done. There are enough and more systems, but one should know how to leverage and one should be willing to leverage. The other thing is that partnerships with corporates, partnership with other funders should be more of a co-creating large, long-term, sustainable models. Probably trying to figure out how do we do research, how do we do studies so that we can do customized and focused interventions. Right now, I think I can think of these, and I'll be happy to hear other people as well.
Anyone else want to comment on logistics and getting food to the people who need it?
I'm happy to talk about that sort of last mile redistribution question from our perspective at Olio. So in addition to connecting neighbours to share surplus food with one another, we've got another aspect to the business, and that is where we work with businesses that have surplus food stuck in the supply chain, wherever it might be. So it might be at a store, or it might be at a warehouse or somewhere. And essentially, those businesses reach out to us, and via the app platform, we are able to essentially send out an advert to everybody who is on the app near that food. And all of our kind of, those adverts are shown to our trained volunteers who are near that food, and they can then basically book a collection slot to pick up that food and then take it to their homes and redistribute it to the local community. So essentially what we are doing is, where we have a surplus of food, we're not having a long supply chain to try and move it elsewhere. We are just redistributing it hyper locally in the immediate vicinity to that community through harnessing the power of mobile technology and a trained volunteer force. And so we have 8,000 volunteers, and in the past 30 days, the amount of food that we've redistributed using this model has doubled. And we've had formed a number of partnerships with businesses that we've never worked with before, who have reached out to us and just said, help, we have these enormous quantities of food. It's short shelf life, and we don't want it to go to waste. And that sort of technology plus community redistribution based model is working very well.
Great. Anyone else for this particular logistics question? If not, I'm going to move on to Elijah. Yes.
Yeah, so looking at the situation in Ghana in terms of the impact of technology, or the role that technology plays in ensuring efficiency of using logistics to get food to people. I believe it's new and it's quite needs to be more intensified. Looking at a country with a population of 30 million, and also our roads network system being not so like the developed world, we believe technology should play a more intensified role, especially when it comes to hospitality companies that you use the food products from production, that process the food product, and as well processors need to look at how they will move away from just the traditional means of processing food and then getting to the local market or the supermarket and retail, and including more of technology to get food to the community level. I believe that will be quite helpful, and it's one line we are looking as well. We learned this experience from this past few weeks, and we're looking at pushing.
Great, thank you. This innovation, I think, is helpful for people to understand. I'm going to open it up to some of our attendees to ask a question. Jacqueline Robinson, I believe you have a question, so I'm going to, if you would like to, you're unmuted now, if you'd like to ask a question.
Sure. You all did a fantastic job of answering my question on some large barriers to supplying food right now. Another one that actually came to mind was how we can start to empower residents at the local level that are, severely impacted by food insecurity, especially while we're waiting for some of these more macro level policy changes to take place. What suggestions do you have? Are there more microloans that are being provided to the more remote communities at this time?
Who would like to take that answer?
So maybe I can take it. In fact, it's true that we need to think about these challenges. There is a platform called Business for Inclusive Growth that is gathering almost 40 companies, global companies, but also articulated by the OECD. And this started with the developed countries as members of OECD. But one of the main challenges for inclusion is exploring innovative ways to have financing, and financing in inclusive way. And this is a common effort. We need to think and innovate a lot in the financing schemes. There are some initiatives. The money associated to development programs, it could be reoriented in some way with some new KPIs associated, for example, to distribution, to reach to poor people, to some environmental KPIs, transforming the food systems. So we have an opportunity to talk about financing as a policy enabler for these changes that we need, but also to support in this moment the system to be there when it's needed. Yes, there is a challenge, there are ongoing conversations, but for sure we need to accelerate and to enlarge the discussion and take it local. And again, it's important to localize the conversation because it's not the same conversation what we are going to have in India than in Ghana. And we need to have the local actors gathering and exploring with the facilitation of these type of platforms, the conversation.
I think the one thing I would add to that is that conversations around universal basic income are now being rapidly accelerated, and I do think that is a very interesting area, because ultimately the responsibility of any government is the well-being of its population. That is what it exists for, and for far too long our governments have not played the role that they're supposed to play. I don't know whether UBI is the solution or not, but now is certainly the time for us to be taking that leap and experimenting with real innovations, which for far too long we've just been talking about and debating about. And I do think that sort of empowering people to be agents themselves and to give them just the basic income to be able to do that is really important. And then the second thing that I would add, obviously, is the power of community, which I think communities have been decimated over the past 20, 30 years. And that is why I think we do have so much food poverty, because people are isolated. And when you're isolated from your community, then you don't have that support network in place. And I do think that mobile technology combined with local community groups is going to be a really important way forward. If we can just connect people with their local communities, that's a great step forward to making sure that no one sort of slips through the net.
Thank you. Thank you for the question, Jacqueline. That was, I'm glad, I hope that we answered that effectively. Now I'd like to turn the attention over to food waste and what the role of food waste is in helping to solve this overall food poverty issue. I think Tessa brought it up in the beginning and mentioned that, what we're seeing is hunger and food waste at the same, living simultaneously. And Siobhan mentioned that this pandemic is different than other food crises that we've seen in the past. Can we first touch on to what extent is addressing food waste the answer to food poverty? Tessa, I think, why don't you take that first?
This is something I feel very, very strongly about. So let's just talk philosophically at first. So I think it's just too convenient for us to think we have a problem of food poverty here, we have a problem of food waste here. Why don't we get all these hungry people to eat all this food waste and we can all live happily ever after? And that seems very appealing, but it's just wildly misleading on two levels. First of all, if you work in the world of food waste, you very quickly realize that there aren't enough hungry people to eat all the food that we waste. So the amount of food that is wasted in the Western world alone, a quarter of that could feed all the 800 million hungry people we have. So we are awash with food, and hungry people will not solve the food waste problem. And then if you take it from the hunger perspective, the solution to hunger is not sporadic handouts of food waste. It is a proper infrastructure. It is access to healthcare, access to education, perhaps something like universal basic income, proper mental health services, a minimum living wage. And so I think it is too easy to conflate these two things together. That's my very strong philosophical belief. However, when you're then looking kind of in the trenches at the practicalities of the day-to-day stuff, and we have some people who are desperately hungry and we have food that is being wasted, I think it is a very sensible and very important sort of tactical initiative to try and divert as much of that food as possible to the people who need it. And there are lots and lots of people working furiously to make that happen. But to make even more of it happen, I think we need sort of regulatory changes to take place. We need things such as the measurement of food waste to be mandated for businesses. They have to publish their food waste data, where it happens in the supply chain, because that will make them work much harder to stop wasting food and to work harder at redistributing it. And I think we need to look at things like date labeling and stuff like that as well. So philosophically, they're not the answer to each other, but very practically in the short term, I think great work is being done at the intersection of those two problems.
Great. Anyone else have anything to add? Elijah, I know that this is an area that you focus on a lot as well.
Clearly, there are several challenges about food waste and how to structure in a proper way all the relationships in the ecosystem. And it's clearly not a circumstantial aid that is going to solve the problems, for sure, as Tessa is saying. And we have a lot of challenges also educating consumers in the day-to-day to avoid unnecessary food waste. I am talking about just labeling, understanding what means the label, what is the best before. It's not an expiration date. So that is also one aspect that we need to take into account, and we can work together educating consumers on this, all these institutions, because it's a pity that it's happening. And this is one element that is a quick win, but also the different frameworks about the regulations that are blocking donations in a systematic way, all the food safety precautions. And there is a mosaic. The regulatory framework in the world is not the same. So we have challenges in some regions. A global food banking network is working perfectly, assessing the opportunities in these areas. As Tessa was mentioning, we need to have a comprehensive approach.
Great. Thank you. Anyone else on food waste before we move on to the next question?
Yeah, I can come in there as well on food waste. I think, I mean, this is obviously a big area of work that FAO has been working on, and I think the COVID crisis really obviously emphasizes it, but a lot of the actual recommendations and actions don't really differ, no? And they just emphasize the importance, for instance, in developing countries, the whole issue now of storage. Like as I was saying, that yields and harvests are doing, for the most part, on the global level, they're doing well. And so, but because of the logistics issues that we heard about, there is a big risk there for food losses. And so then this emphasizes the need for storage, infrastructure, good inventory practices, and also those linkages along the chain, the coordination between the actors along the chain. And that just isn't happening for a lot of commodities in a lot of countries. And you see the food losses there. So it's going to be, you know, it's escalating at the moment because of COVID, but the recommendations are just, they're emphasized there. And then also the issue about technologies kicking in as well, proper food processing, up-to-date food processing technologies that are efficient, that don't lose food as they're being processed, and also the packaging as well is an important area. So then you're linked then into the investment, you know, how to guide investments. So there are investors there on the food and agricultural sector, trying to understand where to invest, and yeah, providing that guidance to the private sector and to governments for those investors there is important. So
thank you, Siobhan.
Okay, over.
We're going to take a question from the audience. So El Marie, I just unmuted you. Your hand has been up. So if you could, if you want to ask a question now to the panelists, we'll take your question now.
Hi, yes, I understand that it's there's a conflict between regulation and also really getting food to people who are really hungry. I'm looking with great interest at what's happening in South Africa. And we see on the media food queues of more than 3 kilometers long, of people desperately queuing to try and get food. And at the same time, the government taking extreme action and arresting NGO volunteers for handing out food to these communities because they're not following the regulatory processes. And I wonder what, you know, at this very moment, about the conflict between regulation and really helping people and what to do. How do you overcome those bureaucratic the issues with bureaucracy that's preventing people from getting food? I mean, that's just I'm just concerned about that, because I see more and more and more of very, very strict action being taken in the country, and I see the same kind of thing happening in Malaysia, not to the same extent, but again, that centralization of the help given to people at this current moment versus the need, and people actually sitting, going without food for 4 to 5 days.
Great, so it's about the centralization of food delivery and just addressing this food crisis, and you know what the role of government is in this is. So anyone who wants to take that question with the
I've got a quick example. So in the UK, sort of long overdue, but last week, as a result of conversations between some of the largest food manufacturers and food retailers, plus RAP, which is the government body that's responsible for managing resources and preventing waste, they finally have issued very strong guidance saying that food that is after its best before date, businesses now have a responsibility according to the food redistribution hierarchy legally to redistribute that food. And that's a really important step forward, because to date, food that's after its best before date, which by the way is perfectly safe for people to be eaten, was far too often being thrown away. And now very clear guidance has been sent to business saying you have to make best efforts to redistribute food after its best before date, and that will free up an enormous amount of food to be available for redistribution. So I do think that these, you know, and that's something that's been talked about for years, but the crisis has accelerated that and made some decisions happen. So I hope that can happen in other countries as well.
Snigdha, did you have?
Yes. Yeah, I think between, you know, whether it should be centralized or not, I don't think so. There can be an either or situation. Like in India example, the government is the only one that has the kind of resources, money, and the reach through their systems to actually get a uniform quantity and quality to all the people. But at the same time, there are enough and more organizations, supporters, donations that want to help and support. And only if the government does not allow that to happen, they're actually limiting it. And if we depend only on the government to do it, then we are also limiting it. So I think it has to be both. Can't be either or. Yeah.
Right. Thank you for the question. I'm going to do one final question. We're nearly at time, but I think we can go for a little bit longer, if that's okay with all of our panelists. So the question that I have actually came in through the chat thread, and I thought it was an interesting one that we could address. What would paradigm shift would be needed to achieve food security for all? We clearly can't go back to business as usual after this pandemic. Was wondering, the question was, you know, really focused on what have we learned from this and how do we move forward? So to start out, Facundo, would you like to kick this off?
30 seconds. I think that we need to change the mindset, and we need to install the concept of affordability. It's something that is affordable but has value, not cheap food. Cheap food is not enough. For the future, we need to have real nutritious food available.
Great. Anyone else?
I'm happy
Yes,
to jump in.
I want to talk more about inclusiveness in terms of food distribution. When corporate bodies or people, organizations that produce food on large scale, like Nestle and the rest, thinks about their customers, their customer segmentation should go beyond just those who can afford their products. Then we can be looking at, okay, so yes, our market share is to make profits. However, in being inclusive, how can we get a certain percentage of our products at a certain point in time whilst the product is within the food supply chain, or probably right from the factory, a certain percentage is connected to those who don't have purchasing power. I believe that will go a long way to change how food moves along our food supply chain. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else to contribute to that?
Yeah, I think that if you want a true paradigm shift, and this is sort of here in the UK specifically, it might be applicable elsewhere. I'm a big believer in what gets measured gets done. And in the UK, we do not have a measure of food poverty. The government does not know how many of its population and where are living in food poverty and how that's trending or changing over time. And there are no targets set with therefore being able to address that. And I think that if we had a national, real-time, sort of longitudinal measure of food poverty with targets set against it that were legislated, we would very quickly see meaningful action on the horrific social inequality we have in this country.
Wonderful. Any final thoughts before we conclude for this incredible session?
Yes, if I may, on the last point there, I'm very enthusiastic about the current dialogue that's going on with vis-a-vis food systems and the concept and the idea of food systems. And I think this is definitely part of the response to food insecurity, the concept of embracing the complexity of food systems and of bringing together and creating the space for multi-sectoral dialogue on food systems is something that we're seeing a lot of now, bringing in the different and intertwined, and what COVID as well has really emphasized the interconnectedness, of us geographically, but also the interconnectedness of health and food and nutrition and poverty. And so, I'd say that would be my point there. Kind of the different dialogues and mechanisms that we see, and FAO and the World Food Programme and IFAD and the World Economic Forum now is building up to providing a path to 2021 to a food system summit. And it's really between now and then that's important in terms of trying to develop and converge the different parallel initiatives and dialogues that are going on to further us towards a world where food security is something that can be relied upon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks to everybody for joining. We had a fascinating conversation. I think it was incredibly helpful. I want to just say thank you to all of our panelists for providing their experience and their expertise. Thanks to Meaningful Business for arranging such an incredible lineup. We're going to be sharing a recording of this session with all of you, along with the contact information of all of our, and the details of all of our panelists and their organizations, in case you want to reach out, and in case, more importantly, there's any way that you can help them. Hopefully we'll continue this dialogue. It's a really important issue, and thank you all for participating in it, and let's just keep this conversation going. So have a great day, and thanks again for participating.